Stop reading for a second and look at your feet. Just sitting there doing nothing, right? Wrong. Even right now, even glued to a chair, your body is making thousands of tiny corrections a minute, nudging muscles a fraction of a millimeter this way and that, just to keep you from tipping over. We call this postural sway, and here's the strange part: nobody is ever actually still. Not you, not me, not a soldier standing at attention. We are all swaying, all the time, in tiny invisible figure eights, like a buoy bobbing on a lake so calm you'd swear it was glass. Your brain has been running this background program since before you could talk, and it's so good at its job that you've never once had to think about it. Which is exactly the problem, because the things our bodies do without asking permission are usually the things hiding the most interesting engineering. It's the same trick your lungs pull on you with every breath, air rushing in and out 12, 16, 20 times a minute, and you almost never consciously notice unless you stop and pay attention. The boring, automatic stuff is where the real engineering lies, precisely because it's too important to be left to a part of the brain that gets distracted by lunch. So let's pull back the curtain on this one. Today we're going to find out why an old, almost silly party trick, standing on one leg for 60 seconds, turns out to be one of the simplest windows we have into the health of your brain. To understand why, we have to start small with the wiring. Picture your nervous system not as some mystical glowing web, but as literal electrical cable, millions of wet, salty wires running from your toes to your skull, carrying voltage instead of vibes. A nerve signal isn't a metaphor for electricity, it basically is electricity, just slower and soggier than the stuff running through your phone charger. And here's a number worth keeping in your back pocket: the fastest of these wires, the thick insulated ones running to your leg muscles, fire signals at around 120 meters per second. That's roughly 270 miles an hour. A Formula One car blazing down a wet, salty highway made of your own flesh. So when your ankle wobbles even slightly, a signal rockets up to your spinal cord and brainstem, gets processed, and a correction order rockets back down, all inside about 1/10 of a second. 1/10 of a second. That's your golden number for today. Write it down, because we're going to need it. Faster than you can blink, faster than you can consciously notice you wobbled at all, your body has already caught itself. You only ever noticed the wobbles that 1/10 of a second wasn't fast enough to fix. But wiring alone doesn't run a machine. Wiring needs fuel, and fuel needs pipes. So before we go any further up into the brain, let's go down into the plumbing for a second, because your cerebellum and your wobbling ankle muscles are both, right now, being kept alive by the same pump: your heart, a fist-sized bag of muscle that has been contracting roughly once a second since before you were born, pushing blood through something like 60,000 miles of vessels, arteries, veins, and capillaries so fine that red blood cells have to line up single file to squeeze through them. Over the course of one ordinary day, that pump moves something close to 2,000 gallons of blood, not by magic, but by the same fluid dynamics an engineer would use to design any pressurized pipe system. Pressure differentials, one-way valves, and tubes that narrow exactly where more force is needed and widen exactly where the flow needs to slow down and trade its oxygen for waste. Every time your cerebellum fires off one of those 100-millisecond correction signals, it's drawing on fresh oxygen and glucose that arrived through this network just seconds earlier. Cut the pipes, even briefly, and the wiring goes dark, which is exactly what's happening in tiny, silent, localized patches. In those small vessel disease cases the balance test turns out to be so good at flagging. The wiring tells the story, but the pipes are what make the story possible in the first place. Now, where does this 100-millisecond rescue signal actually come from? Not from one source, but three, all reporting at once, like three different scouts radioing back to headquarters. The first scout is your eyes, obviously. They tell your brain where the horizon is. Cover them, and balancing gets noticeably harder. That's why standing on one leg with your eyes shut is so much tougher than with them open. The second scout is buried in your inner ear, a little chamber called the vestibular system, and this one is a genuine masterpiece of plumbing. Inside your skull, you're carrying three tiny fluid-filled loops, oriented at right angles to each other, like a three-dimensional spirit level a carpenter would kill for. When you tilt your head, the fluid in those loops sloshes ever so slightly behind, the way water sloshes backward in a glass when you turn a corner too fast, And tiny hair cells detect that lag and translate it into we're tilting. It's fluid dynamics, repurposed by evolution into a built-in gyroscope. The third scout is spread through your muscles and joints. Pressure sensors and stretch sensors called proprioceptors, which is just a fancy word for the sense that tells you where your own limbs are without looking. Close your eyes and touch your nose. That's proprioception doing its job. Three scouts, three completely different forms of physics: light, fluid, and pressure, all converging on one tiny structure at the back of your brain called the cerebellum, which is basically the body's air traffic controller, taking in three garbled radio reports and shouting out one clean, unified instruction to your muscles. This is where the standing on one leg trick gets clever, because most of the time you cheat. With 2 feet on the ground, you've got a nice wide base, and the system barely has to work. It's like trying to test a car's brakes by coasting downhill at 2 miles an hour. But lift 1 foot, and suddenly your base of support shrinks to the size of your shoe sole. There's no redundancy left. The cerebellum can't average 2 feet's worth of pressure data anymore. It has to listen to 1 foot in real time and fire off corrections through that 100-millisecond loop over and over and over, dozens of times a second, just to keep one stick balanced on top of another stick balanced on top of a third wobbly stick, which, let's be honest, is basically what your leg, hip, and spine are. Engineers have a phrase for this kind of test. They call it a stress test, deliberately removing a system's safety margin to see how the core machinery performs when it actually has to. Standing on one leg is a stress test for your entire neurological balance network, performed for free in your kitchen, in your socks. And here's where it stops being a party trick and starts being genuinely interesting science. Researchers in Japan, led by a scientist named Yasuharu Tabara, ran a study on nearly 1,400 otherwise healthy adults, average age around 67. The test was simple: stand on one leg, eyes open, see how long you last, up to a cap of 60 seconds. What they found when they scanned these people's brains was startling. People who couldn't hold the position for at least 20 seconds were significantly more likely to already have what's called cerebral small vessel disease. Tiny silent strokes and microscopic bleeds, the kind that cause no obvious symptoms but slowly chip away at memory and cognition over the years. The shorter people's balance times were, the more of these tiny lesions showed up on their scans, and the lower their cognitive scores tended to be, even though every single one of these people felt perfectly fine, walking around with no idea anything was wrong. So here's golden number 2 for your blackboard: 20 seconds. In this research, 20 seconds was roughly the line between an unremarkable result and a body quietly flagging. Something upstream might need a closer look. With 60 seconds set as the ceiling for the test itself, one tiny posture, an entire weather report on the state of the wiring inside your skull. Why would this be true? Think about the body, machine logic again. Balance isn't a single organ, it's a relay race between the eyes, the inner ear, the spinal cord, the proprioceptive sensors, and finally the cerebellum stitching it all together. A relay race is only as fast as its slowest leg. If a silent stroke has damaged a tiny patch of tissue somewhere along that route, say, a microscopic blood vessel feeding part of the cerebellum, or a fiber tract connecting it to the spine, the whole relay slows down, even if every other part of your brain, the part you use to talk and think and remember your shopping list, seems totally untouched. The conscious, talking part of your brain can be completely unaware that anything's wrong, while the older, automatic part, the part running that 100-millisecond loop 1,000 times a day, starts quietly stumbling. Balance, in other words, is one of the few jobs your brain does that's almost impossible to fake. You can't think your way to a steady ankle. Either the wiring delivers the signal in time, or it doesn't, and your body tells on itself. There's a second, more hopeful layer to this story, and it has to do with thermodynamics, the science of how energy moves and gets used up. Every correction your cerebellum fires off costs fuel. Your muscles are tiny engines, slow, burning fires converting sugar and oxygen into motion, and your whole body runs at an astonishingly steady 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius, golden number 3. A temperature window so narrow that a few degrees in either direction and the chemical reactions keeping you alive start to misfire. That heat isn't decoration, it's the visible exhaust of 1 trillion tiny chemical fires burning in perfect synchrony, all tuned to that one temperature, all powering, among other things, the muscle twitches that keep you from falling over. Practicing something as small as standing on one leg for 60 seconds, a few times a week, is essentially exercise for that whole furnace and wiring system at once. It forces the cerebellum to keep recruiting and refining its correction circuits, the same way lifting weights forces muscle fibers to thicken. The brain, it turns out, treats balance the same way it treats any skill. Practice it, and the relevant wiring gets faster, more efficient, more resilient. This is the quiet idea hiding inside that 60-second test. It's not just a measurement done regularly, it's also training, a kind of physical therapy for the very system that's being measured, strengthening the eyes, ear, muscle, cerebellum relay before age or illness gets the chance to slow it down. Which is part of why fall prevention programs for older adults so often include exactly this exercise, not because falling is the disease, but because poor balance is often the earliest visible symptom of changes happening deep inside, invisible, silent, electrical changes the rest of the body hasn't caught up to noticing yet. Now let's zoom all the way out, because this is the part I love most. That 100-millisecond electrical pulse traveling down your leg right now is made of the exact same physics as a lightning bolt. Charged particles moving through a conductive medium, obeying the same laws Maxwell wrote down for the entire universe, not just for bodies. The calcium and potassium ions doing the actual work inside your nerve cells were forged inside the heart of a dying star billions of years before your solar system even existed. Flung outward in a supernova, drifting through space for wounds, before gravity eventually clumped them into a planet, into rock, into plants, into food, into you. The same gravity your inner ear is fighting against every single second to keep you upright is the very same force that pulled those atoms together into the floor you're standing on, the planet you're standing on, the star burning 93 million miles away that's currently powering the metabolic fire in your muscles. Standing on one leg, in other words, is a tiny local skirmish in the oldest argument in the universe. Order against entropy, structure against collapse, a star's worth of borrowed atoms organizing themselves, however briefly, into something that can notice it's wobbling and choose to correct itself. Most of the universe doesn't get to do that. Rocks don't self-correct. Rivers don't notice they're drifting. But you do 1,000 times a day without even being asked. So here's what I'd leave you with. The next time you're brushing your teeth or waiting for the kettle, lift one foot off the ground and just hold it there. Feel that fine, busy trembling in your ankle. That's not weakness, that's not clumsiness, that's a relay team of light, fluid, and pressure sensors firing reports at 270 miles an hour, getting stitched together by a fist-sized traffic controller at the base of your skull. Also, that one impossibly improbable arrangement of stardust can keep standing up against the pull of an entire planet. 60 seconds. That's all the test asks for. But really, it's asking something much bigger. Are the wires still fast? Is the fire still burning at the right temperature? Are the pipes still open? Is the whole beautiful, borrowed, temporary machine still talking to itself the way it's supposed to? Stand there, wobble a little, and notice. Really notice that you're not just a body holding still. You're a conversation happening in real time between the stars that made you and the ground that's pulling you back down to them. And for 60 seconds at a time, you get to win.